So I went abroad to study after a year work experience, and I went to the Bartlett, which was at the University College London. And if I had to do it again, I think I would have worked for probably 2 or 3 years before going abroad, because I do feel that, like many other courses, architecture doesn't really prepare you for, or at least the way that architecture is taught at most schools, not just in India but around the world, doesn't really prepare you for what's in the real world, assuming, of course, that you end up practicing as an architect. So, having said that, I think if you do intend to continue practicing as an architect, then it makes a lot of sense to gather at least a couple of years of work experience before you go abroad, and that helps you assimilate the information from your master's course better, and to be able to apply it back into real world practice makes a lot more sense to me. Um, how relevant is it and how different is it? Well, okay, let me put it this way. When I was at college in Mumbai, I did feel like the dialogue, so to speak, or that there wasn't really a system of critiques. There wasn't really too much of encouragement, I would say, to be able to think outside of the box, or to be able to think even for oneself. Right? Just to put it in context, we always had a site, we always had a brief, we always had a program that were given to us by the college. And having gone to the Bartlett to study, I did very much feel like I was being pushed into the deep end of the pool, and I had to learn how to swim very quickly. So, what do I mean when I say that? I mean that there was no brief, there was no site, there was no program, there was no client. You had to make it all up. So, which is a lot harder, because there are questions that you never had asked before. So you had always assumed that these things would be given. But again, coming back to the real world, it's quite often that one has to help a client formulate a brief, sometimes even find a site for that perfect house. And so in those cases, I do feel like there is a very strong ability that is required to be able to think for oneself critically. And I felt like that was something that I definitely gained from being abroad. How is their approach different from us? Well, there's much less of spoon feeding. So, in terms of the course I attended, which was the Masters in Architectural Design at the Bartlett, it was, in terms of teaching time or tutorial time, it was actually 45 minutes once a week. And then it was just expected that you make the most out of the rest of the time by putting in studio hours. It's also, I think, very important where you go. So when you go to a city, like to a world city like London or New York, I think that your experience of the master's degree or any further education you do will be about, let's say, 30% of what you learn in the class, and I'd say 70% of what you make of this place that you're in, with these wonderful opportunities and seminars and speakers and museums and exhibitions, and just the fabric of the city itself, and being able to walk around and discover a new place. So, in fact, recently someone was asking if I think it's a good idea, in light of the pandemic, that they should pursue a master's via an online correspondence course, and I had a very short answer: no. I don't think it's a good idea. So if you can afford it, and if it's the same money, I would definitely always choose to go away and learn that. Don't be in a rush. Get a couple of solid years. Ideally, try to build something. Try to understand how buildings come together. Try to understand what goes into the making of a building before being in such a rush to buzz off abroad. I guess it was a confluence of several fairly telltale signs. I mean, I was reasonably good at maths, I was reasonably good at physics. I sort of thought I could sketch a little bit, at least until I came to architecture school. And I enjoyed building things. I enjoyed making things with my hands. That's true to this day. I think when I was a kid it was Lego. Now it might be more to do with carpentry or joinery or fixing a cycle or. But yeah, and I guess I didn't realize that as an architect one doesn't actually end up building much with one's own hands, but there's still something very special about being able to see the thing that you've drawn, the line that you've drawn, coming to life on site and coming into built form. So there's something quite undeniable undeniably special, I would say, about that. I think I was quite clear always that I did. I mean, most students in India, I think, when they talk of going abroad, think of the US, the UK, and Australia, and largely that's to do with language. I suppose Canada included. I was quite clear in my mind that I wanted to go to the UK, and I always had a preference between, well, let's say Europe at least. I always had a preference between the Architectural Association, the Bartlett, the Berlage School in Rotterdam, and I think that a very little research showed that basically between the AA and the Bartlett, which are tremendous rivals across only several streets of the same area in London, both these schools were doing very groundbreaking, very cutting edge work. I think the thing that tipped the scales in the favor of the Bartlett was 2 points. One is that I think I didn't get into the particular course that I wished to do at the AA, and the course that they offered me in its place was not something that interested me. The second was Peter Cook, and I can't understate what a great influence this guy has been upon me. So Peter Cook actually moved from the AA to the Bartlett and is responsible, I'd say, in many ways for the Bartlett being the school that it was today, because it was always perceived as this rather staid, very almost traditional bastion of English architecture, and then along came this guy who had done all these insane things with Archigram in the 60s, who was 67 when I went there and was just finishing his first building. And there was a lot of criticism of that being a paper architect or a visionary architect. And I think, I mean, we can talk more about the term visionary architect or paper architect, but I think that he was really, really instrumental in taking this school to places where you were breaking boundaries, thinking for yourself, forcing open new directions, new lines of inquiry. And there was a very strong system of, there's the unit system in the Bartlett, and each unit follows almost a particular train of thought or a particular thread. So you'll find one which is working with film, you'll find one which is connected with history and theory, there'll be a unit which is connected with responsive mechanism, there'll be a unit which looks at technology in the city, and so on. And so these struck me as, I mean, honestly, I didn't know really about the unit system until I got there. But the idea of having somebody like Peter Cook in charge of the direction of the school is very appealing. So I think that's why London, and that's why the Bartlett. I did work at Marks Barfield, I did work at David Chipperfield, but I should also point out here that those were during the last 6 months of my time in London, and that was a very tumultuous time. So I think when I went to the UK, I always knew that I would come back at some time. I always wanted to come back and practice on my own in India. I don't know where that comes from. Perhaps it's a misplaced sense of patriotism. Perhaps it's not misplaced at all. Perhaps it's an idea that one wants to avoid this typical sort of brain drain situation where you go abroad, study, and then armed with that knowledge to not come back and not plug that back into the place where you're from seems almost a bit of a cop out to me. So Marks Barfield and David Chipperfield were 2 out of 3 firms that I worked with during my last 6 months in London. Why such quick turnovers? Well, so I think the firm that's probably had the most influence on me during my time in London is Archer Architects, where I had the fortune to work with a guy called Stephen Archer, which was a mid-sized practice based in Shoreditch in central London. And I was there for just over 2 years. And then the financial crash of 2008 happened. So I was made redundant from Archer Architects. I was fortunate enough to get a job at Marks Barfield, where I worked for 10 days before they lost a whole ton of work in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and in London, and so got made redundant from there. And then was again fortunate to get picked up by David Chipperfield Architects, where I worked for 3 months, and then got made redundant from there. think after all these things happen, one starts to take some time and reflect out, because when the last job loss at Chipperfield happened, I was basically quite disheartened and thought immediately that I was going to go back to India. I didn't go back immediately. I hung around. I think I lived a pretty good life and expended or blew up whatever savings I had in London. I traveled, I went to New York, I went to Brazil, I traveled around a bit in Europe. I soaked up museums and bars and pubs and cultural events. And I basically lived a very sort of, I think, carefree but also fulfilling life for the last 3 months in London. Um, but basically, when I came back to India, I think there was this strong period of introspection where one feels like one has been, well, for lack of a better word, rejected, made redundant, put out to pasture, whatever, by 3 firms in a very short span of time. And you start wondering whether that's not a reflection on your abilities. And you start wondering whether, if one weren't an architect, what would one do? And I started to take a long, hard look at if this was actually the right profession for me, if it made sense to continue doing what I was doing. If I wasn't doing this, what else would I do? So I grappled with other ideas. I looked at advertising, I looked at the catering business, I looked at branding, and I think finally I came full circle and came back to doing what it is that I thought I knew best how to do. But I should say that also it took a while to come back to the same level of confidence in one's abilities. And I didn't work immediately for myself. I had this opportunity to come back and look at various other practices that were here, and the first job that I took up was with Ratan Batiboy Architects, and I worked with Ratan Batiboy for a year, just under a year. I moved on from there because there was a sense of slight frustration at not being able to get on site with the project that I was on. So the particular project that I was on remained in the feasibility, concept, costing, whatever stages. And for me, it's always been really important to get stuff built. Ideally I would make it myself, but if I'm even not able to do that, I want to get hands dirty. I want to get stuff on the ground. I want to see things coming out. And unfortunately, the work that I was doing at Ratan was at a phase where I wasn't able to take that forward. Although I've got a lot of respect for Ratan, I think he's a great guy, a great guy to have as a mentor, a great guy to knock ideas around with, who's also shown that you can be multidisciplinary. He does a lot of things quite successfully. After working with Ratan for a year, I went to work with Sanjay Puri, which I did for nearly 4 years. I think there were a lot of things that I took away from working with Sanjay as well. Sanjay's a super dynamic guy. He's very quick and he's very sharp, and I think there's a lot of stuff that I could gain from doing there in terms of there were many things that I realized that these were not also the directions I wanted to go, and that was also in terms of the kind of work, the kind of clients. A lot of the work I was dealing with was large developer-led projects. I finished my nearly 4 years at Sanjay's, and so basically in the Indian context, I think it was quite late that I came into private practice or my own practice. I think it was nearly 10 years. So 2014 was when Studio Hint started. 2002 was when I graduated. So yeah, 12 years actually. 12 years after graduating was when I finally started my own practice, after a year of master's degree and more than 10 years of working for other people. Would I have done it differently in retrospect? I don't know. I think that there's not much to be gained from asking that question, but I don't regret the bulk of experience that I've built up during that time, and I can also see in quite a lot of ways how it feeds back into the kind of work that I'm doing now. Not necessarily in terms of creative process, but perhaps in terms of detailing, perhaps in terms of in terms of how to manage clients, perhaps in terms of how to just organize data or how not to in certain cases. We do also do a lot of mock-ups. I've had the good fortune to be married to a lighting designer. So my wife is somebody who used to also work together with me. She now runs her independent practice. She has a master's degree, so it's always a joke that she's far more qualified than I am. I did a master's degree in architectural design. She did a master's in lighting design. She's also able to add, I think, a layer of sophistication to the projects that we've done together, which have been a few recently, wherein I think with lighting in particular, the way that we looked at it before was to try and find a light fixture that was beautiful, and that largely ends up with you relying on decorative fixtures without really looking into what is the quality of light that those fixtures are providing. So it's not really, let me be clearer, it's not really what the light looks like, it's what the light does. So sure, when you want a decorative light, you want a decorative light as a statement piece, but when you want a technical light, it's less important what that light looks like. It's more important how that light behaves in terms of its color rendering, in terms of its beam angle, in terms of its evenness, in terms of its ability to pick up or highlight or subdue textures, in terms of its color temperature, in terms of the mood that it sets. So the conversations that she and I have often lead to talk of lighting that happens almost in layers, which is something that I've started to understand from her. And that's definitely being input back into the practice, because I mean we have traditionally been very interested in lighting design, but I think this has added a new dimension to it, because the lighting design that I would say we were doing earlier was more concerned with the design of the fixture and what the fixture looks like. And although that has been applauded or awarded, or it has had results that have been pleasing, I think now having a more informed and a more solid technical backing to this has definitely informed our work, and you can see that in the more recent projects where we've collaborated together. In terms of materiality and detail, I think this has been a very strong area of interest, and I think it's also something that our work has almost come to be known for. So I think I'm almost happier. The smaller the scale, I'm probably happiest when I'm drawing one-to-one details or doing mock-ups. I'm probably afraid of looking at anything that's more than 1:200 scale, because I've honestly, in the practice that we're doing right now, never had the opportunity to do that. Which is not to say I wouldn't like to, but there's a comfort level, and perhaps it comes a time that one needs to break out of one's comfort level. But I know that I'm most comfortable when we're working on detail. It's also something that we're very happy to do, and it's something that we get into very early in the process. So even at the concept design stage, we're always asking these questions: what is this made out of? How does it stand? How does it come together? Have you thought of what exactly the material is going to be? Where is it going to be sourced from? So I would say questions that traditionally come much later in a typical design process occur to us much earlier, which in terms of what that means, I think it means that we take a lot more time over concept and design development stage. But I would like to believe that we go into the construction documentation or even the actual construction phase with a much more detailed set of information, specifications, BOQs, material samples, and that's generally held us in good stead. So I don't mind being the practice that has been come to be known for its work in detail design. I think there was a very interesting point of view I had on this recently when I was listening to a podcast that Marcus Feld of Dezeen did with Hella Jongerius, who's been touted as or branded as probably the most famous female designer in the world. And she was also talking about how difficult it is to do something that is original anymore. because almost everything that you can think of has been done. And it's true, we find this often in practice. I mean, one of the things that I don't like to do as a starting point for a project is start off by looking at, let's say, what's known as reference images. So, designed by Pinterest or designed by Google image search is not the preferred methodology. But we like to say that we start by putting pencil to paper, or I think for some of the kids in the studio, it's more intuitive to almost start in AutoCAD or to almost start in SketchUp or in modeling software. For me, I think the starting point still remains. I mean, I'm conversant in those softwares, but for me, the comfort level is more to start with a pencil and paper still. Having said that, I think there's often times where I've designed something or we've designed something and we go to look for something similar and then find that it actually exists. There exists something remarkably similar in form, in material, in detail, or all of the above to what we've designed. Now, does that mean that that's going to put you off, or you have to crumple the piece of paper on which you designed it and throw it away? I don't think so. I don't think there's any harm in also looking for references. It's not the particular way that I choose to work. But having said that, um, you need to believe, or I believe that you need to be able to develop an idea. So it's not enough to take what someone else has done and apply it, even if it's in context. I think that it's a slightly lazy approach. I think there's a very great expression that I would like to come back to on this, and it's called standing on the shoulders of giants. So there are people before who have done what you're looking to do and have put in possibly more work, possibly more time, possibly greater minds than your own. And there's no shame in standing on the shoulders of these giants. You don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel every time you need to design a wheel. Having said that, there needs to be something new that you can add to this, some layer of information that you can bring that that develops on this. So I would say that fine, you see something, you're inspired, you borrow it, you pick it up, you put it in your design. Not quite enough. I think you need to be able to add a layer of detail, of sophistication, of utility, of cleverness to it. Something that develops upon what you're claiming is your inspiration. So I don't think it's necessarily the worst criticism in the world to say that it's not original. Fine, it's not original, but then I've done this and this and this with it and taken it to a new level, which adds functionality or adds beauty or adds I don't know. Perhaps a layer of sophistication is the best way of putting it. I have a little backstory to this because basically I want to go back to what the definition of an architect is, or where the etymology of the word architect comes from. It comes from architecton, which is the master builder. So you have to remember that the architects of old were basically masons. They were master masons, master craftsmen, carpenters, stonemasons, and also designers. And somewhere during the course of history, the doers have disconnected from the thinkers. And so we now are placing ourselves in the realm of the designer thinkers, and the people who are executing our designs, our karigars or our craftsmen, are in the realm of the doers, are the ones who are actually executing these designs. And it's kind of sad because there's a big disconnect between the doers and the thinkers now. And just as an example, I'd like to point out that when you're in Germany, when you study architecture in Germany, I mean, India, for example, is one of the easiest places in the world to qualify as an architect. And I think that that's actually a bit of a shame, because when you do study architecture in Germany, there's a minimum requirement of 6 months that you have to train as a craftsman, and you have to train in any trade. So you can be a bricklayer, you can be a carpenter, you can be pouring concrete, whatever. But the idea is that the linkage between doing and thinking is very strongly reinforced, and it equips you to be able to deal with the process of design, because you're aware with that training what is feasible and what is not feasible, and how you can stretch those boundaries. Although I do feel that, as I said just now, that we are somehow lacking a bit in the expertise in the doing department. So when we have this syndrome, which we tend to have, this kind of egoistical, almost God syndrome as architects, we think that we know it all, and we think that, and usually there's a fair amount of truth behind that a client comes to you because he trusts your decision-making abilities, because he trusts your design sense, because he trusts your detailing or your technical prowess, and but I think that once you start thinking that you know everything, that's when it starts going downhill. So you have to still remain open to the idea that somebody, whether that's a client, whether that's a contractor, whether that's a welder or a carpenter, is going to still be able to teach you things that you didn't know before. And that's critical. And that's critical because if you start believing that you know everything, then that's the day your learning process stops. So I think it's very important. One of the greatest lessons I took, I think, from Peter Cook when I was at the Bartlett, and it's probably in a quite different context, was to not take oneself too seriously. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But basically, don't take yourself too seriously would be the advice I've given students, the advice to anybody who's looking to start their own practice, and that's not just architecture. Even if you're looking to save the world, you have to be able to have the ability to mock yourself, to laugh at yourself, to learn from the fact that, or to keep your mind open to the idea that somebody who is much less educated than you in terms of conventional education, but has spent a lifetime working with his hands and probably has ancestors who have done the same for 3 generations, is quite likely to be able to teach you something about the act of putting things together that you weren't able to decipher. I think also we need to be quite careful of this God syndrome, because as architects we tend to have this this massive ego, and we wear that almost as a symbol of pride, saying that, well, Mr. Client, you've come to me because I know better, let me handle this. And more often than not, that does tend to be the case. But what would I do for this as an example? But there are equally times when you have to stand your ground, and I think that the education is not always going to do this, but the experience is going to determine when you draw that line between knowing whether you defer to someone else's experience. And I'm not talking about this in terms of when a client wants a wall to be pink and you want it to be green. I'm talking about it more in terms of planning. So for example, on a recent project we had, we broke a significant number of walls in 2 very strategic locations on an apartment interior, where we joined up a study with a living room and a living room with a dining room. And the client was not very excited about this, and there was a lot of convincing and a lot of different conceptual and fairly detailed diagrams and proposals in 3D, in mock-ups that we showed him before we arrived at something that worked. But he was very reluctant to the idea of taking these walls down, and one of the walls we replaced with sliding folding doors, and the other wall we replaced with a partition, which is now kind of the pride and joy or the center of the house. And it's kind of, I won't say vindicating, but it's kind of relieving to hear that from this client when he comes back to say, I'm so happy that I pushed you on this particular partition, on this particular wall, because what we did was we brought down the whole wall and we built something which was like a piece of family history. So it evokes where they're from, it evokes Rajasthan, it talks of deserts, it talks of jalis, it talks of family history, it talks of ancient traditions of deep thumbs, and all these things can be seen in the piece of art that we've created as a room divider in this case. Right? But we didn't come to it in the first go. So it was an iterative process, and I'm very happy that with that particular client that they didn't accept the first thing that we said to them. And initially they didn't even accept the idea that the wall must come down, because they wanted acoustic privacy, they wanted access control. And they made it more challenging for us to design all those things into this particular work of art or this installation piece that we designed. which also acts as a room divider, but that is probably its most prosaic function. So I think in that sense, I'm very happy that you have to be open to challenge. You have to be open to being pushed, and you have to be open to taking a most critical eye towards yourself. And if you're unable to do that yourself, I think it's a very good idea to brainstorm with a colleague or with a contemporary or a senior whose opinion that you trust, that you can bring on as a sort of peer review onto this. And it could be for something as small as a partition. It could be for something at the building scale even. So I studied at the Bartlett, and I had a chance to travel extensively in Europe, which I'm very grateful for. And there were several aspects of the of European design ideologies or outlooks that come through when you talk of, for example, the Italians who at the time, and I'm talking well after the time of Ettore Sottsass and so on, I'm talking about more recently in the 90s and early 2000s, where there would be Italian designers who take themselves really seriously, and you'd have these super sexy sort of fluid curvy designs which were oftentimes quite over the top in terms of what they needed to be. And then you look also at the Dutch designers who, in the same time, when you look at people like Ella Jongeris or Marcel Wonders or Mui, these people who were doing stuff which was very firmly tongue-in-cheek, which was very strongly imbued with a sense of irony, with a sense of humor. I think that we become quite stuffy and boring when we start believing our own hype, taking ourselves too seriously. So I think it's very critical almost to retain a sense of lightheartedness, to retain a sense of humor about what it is that we're doing, and whether that can be through a kind of through a little design twist or a little design secret that possibly no one else even sees except for maybe another designer. Possibly it's an inside joke to yourself. So for example, again coming back to the previous example, in this partition, this wall of family history that we created for this family, we had inserts. So we had these jali cutouts, and into them we had inserts of resin that we worked with an artist friend to create. And into the resin we had cast flower petals and organic objects like leaves, but also objects of family history. So notes written from a mother to a son, a train ticket from an important journey, family photographs. And then, just for a laugh, in about 90 of these, one of them we just cast a hinge and we put it in the bottom right corner of that wall. And I'm not sure if anyone's to date really aware of that, but it was almost like a bit of a, I mean, of course, it's slightly egotistical. It's a bit of a signature on that piece that we've created, but it was quite a bit of fun. And I think, in answer to that, it is very important. It is very important to us to be able to retain a sense of lightheartedness, of irony, of humor, of satire, of even poking fun at oneself in what one does. I think again this comes a bit back to this idea of the God complex, the architect as God. We tend to over-imagine our capability. So I think that there's definitely scope for architects to improve the world, to make it a better place. We definitely would like to believe that we can do more than we're actually capable of doing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's also a type of project which demands a social intervention, and there are those where one would be limited to, let's say, sustainability or the use of local labor or the use of local materials. Like, for example, if I were talking about the interior design of a private home or a private office, there's a very limited scope to go beyond sustainability as an agenda, or as a social agenda. But on another project that we're working for example, which which is a library project for a private members club, sure, there's a lot of scope. I mean, there are interesting questions that come up about what does it mean to be a library in the 21st century? How is information consumed? Why would people come to a library, and how does one, in the age of digital media, where you're talking about people consuming, well, first of all, very few people read, and the ones that do anymore read on devices for the most part. So why would people come to a library anymore? And then reinterpreting the idea of a library from a house of books into a house of learning, and making sure that you have an agenda, a social agenda that promotes things like activities like a book club, or a film screening, or workshops for kids, workshops for adults, book readings. So it's events, it's social interaction, it's changing what happens in a library, and also trying to introduce this idea of a wider social agenda, of recognizing that this is a library, yes, for very privileged members club, but can it have an impact on a larger community? Can there be an outreach program that reaches out to kids from lesser privileged backgrounds? Can it also be a center of learning for them, or does it have to be this completely cocoon of space? So yeah, even at the scale that we are working, there are opportunities to do that. Although I'm a firm believer that whilst doing that, one has to continue to continue to maintain your sense of humor, but you continue to not let go of the sense of irony, and allow it to pervade the work. And at the end of the day, continue to not take yourself very seriously. Thanks.